Looping back to Michael Jarry's talk, Philippe and I are also here as representatives of these islands, and I'll just begin by explaining how I came to be involved. And it goes back quite a long way. I grew up in Salisbury, a town that is very much in the news at the moment. And one of the reasons why that attack on Salisbury, I think, has shocked people in this country is that Salisbury is famously boring. It's famous for being a place where nothing really ever happens. It's the epitome of Middle England. And so obviously growing up there, I profoundly resented and disliked it. No, that's not true. I loved it, but it was kind of a love-hate relationship. And so part of me hated the fact that it was the embodiment of Middle England. And as a result, eccentrically, I picked up a book about Scottish nationalism, written by Alistair Gray, a very brilliant novelist, and came completely convinced that the way to strike at the kind of cosy, provincial, comfortable nature of Salisbury was to split the United Kingdom up into workers' republics. So I briefly became Wiltshire's probably only Scottish nationalist. I then moved to Brixton, Chuckramunna's constituency, and I realised that actually this British identity that I had been so kind of sniffily and arrogantly contemptuous of actually had quite a purpose, because in Brixton there were lots of people, and not just the black people there, but people from across the world. Brixton is a famously multicultural region of London. That for people there who might not feel English, Britishness offered them a sense of identity with this country. And so, rather like the alcoholic who gives up alcohol but recognises the kind of the danger of it precisely because he has felt the allure, I've always been very nervous of kind of doctrinaire nationalist identity. And I came to realise that what I most value is a kind of sense of multiple identity, of that I come from Wiltshire, from the kind of heart of the southwest. I'm very proud of it now that I live in London. I'm proud of that. I'm proud to be English moderately. I'm proud to be British, and I'm proud to be European. And so in 2014, during the Scottish referendum, I did my level best to try and make the case for Britain not as something that was purely an economic entity, but as something that provided identity for all of us across the United Kingdom. And in the wake of that, I felt that although those who wanted to stay in the UK and Scotland won, I felt that it was a Pyrrhic victory. And it worried me that people making the case for Scotland staying in the UK had been unwilling to make a kind of emotional case, to talk about Britain and Britishness in terms of identity, as though it was somehow too toxic even to discuss. And so myself, with various other people, thought we should try and set up some kind of framework in which we can talk about this, because there didn't seem to be one. And I should emphasise that this was absolutely not a kind of Pollyanna-ish project. This was not founded on the idea that Britain is great. It was not founded on the idea that everything is perfect. On the contrary, it was founded on the conviction that Britishness, the idea of Britain, is going through quite a degree of crisis, but that you should not let a crisis go to waste. Then, of course, Brexit hit us. As Michael said, we are officially agnostic about Brexit. We do not have a position on it. But what absolutely became clear to us in the wake of the Brexit vote was that issues of identity was now an absolute salient factor for 3 million people who were living in our country, who had chosen to come to our country, who had brought all their talents, who contributed so much. During the referendum, they had been disenfranchised. They had not had a vote. After the referendum, their status was up in the air. And it seemed to me that the issues around what their future status should be were not just legal ones, that it went much deeper. It went into issues of identity And it raised questions about the very nature of what Britain should be in a post-Brexit European order. And so in that context, I thought, well, who am I going to turn to? I'm going to turn to the man who is the embodiment of polymathic European civilization. Musician, sports correspondent, philosopher, Philippe Auclair. And Philippe very, very kindly agreed that he would sign up to us and join us. And Philippe, can I ask you, why did you accept that invitation?
I accepted it. Thank you very much for basically saying exactly what I was going to say about it.
Oh, yes. Je m'excuse.
No problem. Several things. When I have to define myself in terms of identity, which is something I'm not actually very at ease with, but it seems that it's become almost like...
And that's the problem, isn't it? It's awkward to do it.
It is very awkward, because I consider myself a Londoner. I've lived in Shepherd's Bush for 30 years in the same place. My wife has got an English father and an Australian mother. Our daughter is a binational. So in a way, I think I'm like many people in this room here today. But I consider myself a Londoner. I consider myself a Frenchman, very proud of it, very proud Frenchman. Not a French nationalist, but a patriot, certainly. And strangely enough, I also I consider myself a European without a doubt. But also, I've asked myself, do I consider myself British, and could I ever consider myself British after so many years spent here? And realizing, well, I've never asked myself this question until, not the Brexit referendum, but until August 2015, I think it was, when the referendum bill was passed in Parliament. I think there were 2 readings, and nobody seemed to comment about the content of this referendum bill. And I got together with a friend of mine, Robert Rotifer, who is an Austrian who lives in Canterbury, has been living in Britain for 20 years. And we thought it's bizarre, there's no room for us in there. Why is it that, okay, some Europeans will be able to vote the Irish and the Cypriots because they're part of Commonwealth. We're not part of Commonwealth, therefore we won't vote. Then surely Brexit would impact us, perhaps even more than anybody else in this country, because we are settled here. When I hear about settled rights, I have to say that I feel a little bit uneasy about this, because as far as I'm concerned, those rights were already in place, and certainly as a European citizen, as we all know, since the Maastricht Treaty. But anyway, so I thought, well, if we do not have a space, we do not have franchise to vote in this, neither did we have in general elections. Where are we? Who are we? I cannot consider leaving this country. This is where I've made my life. My friends are mostly British, actually, now. And when I'm asked, where is home? I say, well, London is home, no doubt about that. And then thinking, well, but also somehow I do feel British. And I would like to come back to what Michael was talking about, Michael Jarry, that is. When he was talking about, the opening ceremony for the Olympic Games, I remember that night very well. I was in Greece. I was in a Café Neon, little country cafe, with Greek, French, and British friends. And I felt tremendously patriotic. And I was wondering, why do I feel so patriotic? It's because, well, I think, because I'm part of this. I'm part of this. When I see Mr. Bean with Simon Rattle, yeah, that's me too. That's another strand of identity. No, seriously. Am I Mr. Bean and Simon Rattle? Perhaps a bit of both. For my daughter, probably Rowan Atkinson. And it made me realize, well, actually, yes, I do have a place here, a very emotional place. But there is no room for me. And there are 3 million of us. And we're a minority, and we're not a minority. We're the biggest minority in the country. But on the other hand, look around the room. We speak different languages. We all speak English, of course, but we look different. We're of every ethnic subdivision you can imagine. Being a European doesn't mean you're white. You can be European and black. You can be European and have Asian origins. We're not defined by religious affiliation either. What defines us is Europeanity, whatever that is. But how can you then find a place for Europeanity in Britain, where it's so easy in a way to add a little hyphen at the end of British and say, well, I'm British Asian, I'm British Caribbean, and so on, there is not yet an idea of being a British European.
But it's interesting, people tend not to say, for instance, English Asian or English black. It's yep. British Asian, British black. Do you think that there is scope within that notion of Britishness as a kind of a broad tent within which multiple identities can exist? Is there any scope for kind of adapting that sense of British identity to provide a space for the 3 million EU citizens who I very much hope will continue living here after Brexit?
I would think so. Otherwise, I wouldn't have accepted your invitation. But the problem, of course, is that identity and citizenship are two very different things. And we are coming at the point where there's a conflation of both things. I mean, you can feel yourself as a. If you say I feel myself British, I think I would be lying if I said that.
Of course.
I think there's a layer.
French. I mean, the very idea.
I'm French, but there is a layer of it. I'm certainly a Londoner, and that I will never say anything different. But how do you go from a sense of identity to citizenship? So does it mean I've got to take on British citizenship? For many of us who've been here for years, it's a very odd thing. One of the reasons I never considered it is because I thought, a bit like the lapsed Catholic who won't take communion because it would be sacrilegious. It's a bit like taking a passport out of convenience, which is something that many of my European friends who've also lived here for a very long time feel exactly the same about.
Yeah.
It seems to be a bit demeaning to yourself and to the people who welcome you to start with. So you've got to find a way out of that. Now, obviously, the biggest problem we have, I think, Tom, is actually not really for me even the settled status or regulations, even though I hate this idea of having to be on a roll call of aliens. It is an emotional point of view, because I think what was so traumatic for many of us was the feeling of rejection we felt on 24th of June 2016 when the results came in which happened to be my birthday, as I never tire from. Yes, happy birthday, Philippe. And and many of us, I mean, some people have already left. Some people have a very now, I think, tumultuous relationship with Britain, even though it's a country that they deeply love, and I deeply love Britain. So you have to work out, your mind as well as the regulations that are going to be applied. So, and in a way, that's why I'm with these islands, is to try to find an answer to that.
Yeah, because the issue is that at the moment the debate is all about laws, regulations, as you said, rosters, registrations, and there is something kind of Procrustean about that. There is the requirement to stretch and trim identities that may not fit exactly the parameters of a particular conception of civic identity.
And perhaps it has also to do with the fact that European identity is even more englobing than British identity. And I think as well I've got some of my British family lives in Spain, for example.
Yeah.
And there is also a European dimension to the British identity. So this is perhaps where, in the Venn diagram, there is a space that we can explore.
But yes, and it's important to say that there were many on the Brexit supporting side of the debate who would absolutely acknowledge that, who said we are leaving the EU, we are not leaving Europe,
which is what Boris Johnson said in his famous speech at the French embassy, his first speech as a foreign minister. Yes,
and so perhaps there is scope there to formulate, perhaps, looking back kind of 300 years ago when the United Kingdom of Great Britain was forged, British identity was something new. The idea that two countries that historically had been as hostile to one another as England and Scotland could be brought together, and that essentially a kind of new paradigm of identity could be forged that did not replace English or Scottish identity, but complemented it, was something that perhaps might give us hope now that it might be possible in the kind of straitened and rather anguished situation that British citizens in the EU and EU citizens within Britain find themselves perhaps to construct some new model of identity that might provide a paradigm for people across this increasingly globalized and complex world in which 20th century notions of nationhood perhaps are becoming inadequate.
Mm-hmm. But I think it probably has to do with enfranchisement, if that's the correct way of saying it. One of the biggest problems is the fact that you exist without existing.
Yeah.
So, and the franchise, which is the franchise to vote. I mean, and for example, which is quite strange. I mean, I've been approached by a local party to be a candidate at the council elections, which I'm debating now.
Dare I ask which party?
It's the party that is the most closely associated with staying in the European Union.
Oh, right, okay.
And it's not the SNP.
Anna Soubry's party.
That's the one. But sorry, I've lost my thread now. You've thrown me off.
Are you talking about how you've been approached?
Yes, I've been approached.
Enfranchisement.
Enfranchisement, yes, absolutely. And the fact is that without the franchise, and that goes in. I mean, it's a thing that I've been talking about with European friends for actually years, much before the referendum, saying that there is a point where we've got to think of automatic enfranchisement for citizens of the European Union who actually are settled. I'm not talking about people who will come for a day job, for 6 months, or I'm talking people who live here. Very easy to find out. Are they in the electoral roll for the council elections? They are. Okay, so fine.
But it may be that there's a case for doing that with people not even just from the EU, but from people across the world who settle here, because you say how you self-identify as a Londoner. Mm-hmm. The multinational nature of London perhaps requires, I think, creativity on that front.
Absolutely, and maybe we've just hit on something right now. And so I think it's quite a radical way of seeing it, perhaps, but I don't know. I have problems finding another way in, so to speak. And the thing is that we're not just living in limbo at the moment. We are thinking in limbo because we have no idea, to be honest, any of us, what's going to happen within the next 6 months, 8 months, whether there's going to be a longer transition period, whether indeed there will be a new vote like Shuka Umuna was expressing the hope of. We do not know. And at the same time, we are trying to build a structure, and we've got to think in terms of whether there is Brexit or not, whether it is a soft Brexit or a hard Brexit, we'll still be in the same situation. And the thing is that for us as well, even if there is settled status, we'll have lost something, not just in terms of the rights we can exercise, and the fact that apparently for in some areas of our lives, we would not be protected to the same extent as our British friends, but the problem is an emotional one. It's very different if suddenly you find yourself on the registry of aliens compared to what used to be the case beforehand.
So are you tempted to leave?
Yes. It's a subject that's been brought to the family table many, many times. The first time probably almost immediately after the referendum, something that we thought about for... My daughter is leaving.
For France?
No, she's split her time between France and another country, which is, of course, extraordinarily sad. I'm not saying she's leaving just because of Brexit. I'm saying it's one of many contributing factors. And she's British. She's a British, French, European. But I'm a stayer. And I'm like Mr. Umuna, I'm an optimist. Because I think as well this is almost a unique opportunity we've got. As you say, no crisis should be left to waste. None. And it is a huge crisis for us, for the British, for us, the European citizens who live here, for the British in Europe. But perhaps it's a means to actually think a bit more about things that we never genuinely thought about beforehand, because we just came as a right. We never genuinely thought about it. And we took root in a country, in a way we'd been taken there by the wind. just like a seed. And we took root. And then suddenly people are saying, we don't belong here. Or actually some of them even say we should uproot that thing. And
to what extent have you had people say you don't belong here?
On Twitter every day. Some really foul comments.
But Twitter is...
Yeah, foul.
I mean, that's what it's all about, isn't it?
It's what it's all about. I had said it to my face twice since June 2016, never before in 30 years of residing in the United Kingdom. And I've had the funny looks.
Well,
and the funny looks are quite amazing when you hear my accent.
I devoutly believe that the vast majority of people in this country, whether they voted for Brexit or for Remain, value and are grateful to the EU citizens who live here. I hope that you will stay, Philippe. I hope that you will all stay. And I hope, as I say, that we can find some accommodation that will enable this slightly tortured phase of our relationship with the rest of Europe to have perhaps a slightly more happy conclusion than currently seems likely. So thank you very much.
Thank you.